I'd like to move in now to the second part of this first period. I've talked a little bit about some of the influences, the tendency to be quite behavioral, the emphasis on correlational study, the emphasis on measurement and testing being quite profound. And as these things progressed, you saw some repeated tendencies relative to views of reading. Some of them I've already mentioned, that reading was a receptive act, not so much the creation of meaning. That people first had to learn to read before they could read to learn. In other words, they could read and learn from material, where there was an emphasis on teaching beginning reading skills rather than comprehension. And all of this, and over the course, you'll see a break from this. To a large extent, or almost entirely, people were focused on what people do in their head. Reading wasn't viewed as a social act in particular. But as the testing industry progressed and as the reading as a receptive act was emphasized, you had a breaking up of reading and writing and study skills and listening skills, and a proliferation of tests, particularly in conjunction with World War II, in conjunction with the recruitment of a wide range of people using tests to actually diagnose or assess potential career paths as people were being entered into the military. What was most interesting was coming out of those war years was some interesting political context. You had, in a sense, bookends being emphasized. And I say bookends because they represent age parameters. You saw a heavy emphasis, again, on preparing kids for reading or reading readiness, a heavy emphasis on beginning reading. And then you also saw the beginnings of an emphasis upon what was called reading in the content area and study skills. At the same time, as you saw happening politically, a breaking up of the world into blocks, an Eastern bloc, which would include Russia and China, and a Western bloc, which would include Europe and the US. And a fair amount of competition between those blocks, particularly around technological advantage, economic advantage, and social progress, including educational progress. And these issues catapulted forward, particularly as Russia launched Sputnik far ahead of the US. And so all of a sudden, the US started examining itself, and all the countries started examining itself and were asking tough questions about education. Interestingly, a very famous book, popular book, was published at that time called Why Johnny Can't Read. And the question became one of, well, what do we need to do to put in place at the beginning stages of reading, that bookend, and also meeting the people's needs at the end? What do we need to put in place to make sure that our students are getting the best methods? And what we had occur in the educational field was almost like a set of horse races. People were developing different methods for beginning reading, sometimes heavy emphasis on phonics, sometimes heavy emphasis on teaching kids whole words, and sometimes a mix. And they were, in a sense, putting those methods against each other to see which one, in terms of the tests that they developed, the standardized tests, which one would be better for the students. Indeed, you had, this is one book that deals with about 200 different beginning reading methods that appeared at that point in time. And I'm sure if you went from school to school, you would have seen thousands and thousands of different approaches. And you had a famous educator at Harvard at that time, Jean Shaw, write her book, Learning to Read: The Great Debate. Indeed, I suspect it was in this period, this search for the best method would be considered when the reading wars started. where people got very much involved, almost like Republicans versus Democrats in the US, but all over the world, people were developing methods and sort of saying that their method is best for these reasons, and if we put it in a comparison with others, I'm sure it will do better. Well, finally, the federal government put a lot of money behind what they called the cooperative first grade studies. And that was an attempt to look at what would be the best method of teaching reading. And so let me sort of diagram a little bit of what happened here. So we had the political context, and I would say it's a global context, but it's also international, because what you actually had was a sort of a competition over approaches that was spurred by global competition, and then within countries, different people advocating different approaches. And you also had these media sort of releases where they depicted schools as failing, which is a little bit not unlike what we still see experienced today in the media. In reality, schools are not doing more poorly, by the way. Whenever we've actually compared kids on the same tests over time, kids are always improving, and particularly when you take into account the new literacies that they're being asked to develop. But the media drew attention, and then we had what I call the start of the reading wars, leading into the federal government supporting this major effort, the cooperative first grade studies, which was a massive undertaking all over the US in particular, but in several countries, people were actually putting one method against another. Interestingly, what did they find? What's the best method? Well, sadly, or I think probably predictably in hindsight, they really didn't come out with the best method that fit every circumstance. Indeed, depended upon the situation, some methods work better than others. And so they found what would be called situation-specific effects. And then they also found what is the most common result of any educational research experiment. And one is, if you're doing educational research, you need to set yourself up so you can be open to this, is a treatment by aptitude or ability effect. In other words, different kids have different abilities and different aptitudes respond differently to different methods. So you got this situation-specific finding, you got this treatment aptitude ability effect, which is widespread in pretty well any educational study of any method, whether it be reading or mathematics or whatnot. It's probably the most common finding. And then you've got another effect, which is consistent with situation-specific. And that is, it depends upon the teacher. If a teacher embraces a method, chances are they would be relatively effective with that method. And so all of a sudden, and you've also got another finding that came out of here, by the way, and that is that standardized tests are quite lame in terms of showing effects of methods. If you really want to see the effects of a method, don't look to a standardized test to do it. So if you're going to do a study looking at anything and you don't get much results in terms of a standardized test, join the club. Repeatedly, we rarely get effects from standardized tests, and it always sort of makes me sort of depressed when I see a study where a person has invested a lot of time and all they're using is standardized tests to measure effects. Or if the government starts talking about the fact that they're using a standardized test, and I think well, chances are they're not going to show any effect. Standardized tests are too global, too general to show the sorts of effects tied to specific specific methods. So we had the results relative to standardized tests. But indeed, you might sort of say, well, this is sort of depressing. We can't find the best method. But in reality, the finding is much more profound. The most successful methods are likely to be methods that are shaped in the context of classrooms to meet kids' needs from different backgrounds in accordance with the specific situations where they're from and where they go to school and so on. So you saw coming out of here an interest in formative studies. And by that, studies that are much more closely crafted to what you're studying. But you're also seeing another thing, which was part of the findings here that I haven't mentioned at this point. A repeated finding out of this beginning reading research is typically we were seeing students who would perform well for the first couple of years of school, as measured on the tests, which were pretty limited tests. They tend to be tests of sentence comprehensions or word knowledge. But as you move forward into, let's say, the third grade or fourth grade, where the test might involve comprehension measures, you saw a decline. And so kids who might be succeeding very well in the second grade all of a sudden perform poorly. I think to a large extent it was related to the fact that people really hadn't connected learning to read to a meaning-centered approach. And so you have the beginnings of an interest in a concept called eclecticism, which is a mixture of approaches which focused upon learning to read, dovetailed with a sort of a reading to learn approach, or a meaning-oriented approach. But even more so, you're getting people asking the question, well, what about reading comprehension? And this is sort of a precursor to the next lecture, which is the cognitive turn. The federal government in the US and governments all over the world started to ask themselves the question, hey, we've invested a huge amount of money in helping kids learn to read, but what about reading to learn? Do we really know much about comprehension? Is comprehension tied up with intelligence? Is it tied up with a sort of a child's given abilities? Or is it something that you can teach? What do we know about comprehension? Is it something that follows from reading, or is it an integral part of it? And so we had in this 60s period this amazing precursor to what I found, where I sort of entered the field actually, in the late 60s and early 70s, a growing interest, a lot of investment all over this world in the study of reading comprehension. It couldn't have happened at a better time, because scholars from different fields also were interested in this question. Scholars from computer science, artificial intelligence, scholars who were interested in linguistics, particularly psycholinguistics, and interested in shifting to looking at fuller text rather than just sentences. And other people all of a sudden were coming together in a sort of a confluence, which I think many of us agree perpetuated almost a zeitgeist in terms of a shift in our thinking about the nature of meaning making. A shift in our thinking which I think is profound, that should be viewed as a moment in history that is of significance in terms of even going back to sort of early Greek or early Chinese discussions of meaning making. So I'll expand upon these areas as we move to the next lecture, where I talk about these things in conjunction with talking about what I refer to as the cognitive turn. Thanks very much.